شب همگی بخیر. نوروزتون مبارک. همینطور که می‌دونین برنامه به زبان انگلیسیه، با اجازهتون انگلیسی صحبت می‌کنیم. This is the 25th Norûz lecture by a distinguished professor of Iranian studies. During the 25 years since this tradition began, we have had almost every extraordinary scholar, any different parts of the world who have worked on Iranian studies in different areas, have spoken here and have shared their experiences with us. And those experiences have been printed and distributed. And it's been a pleasure and an honor to have this tradition continue. This Norûz, of course, we have good news and bad news, as you all know. The bad news is that we always go back and look. The year that has passed has brought a lot of chaos and violence and unhappiness. But the good news is, or potentially good news we'll have to see, is that some softening of relationships between the US and Iran has happened. And we have bright moments, such as when the President of the United States speaks so warmly about Iran and about our Sabzi-Mahi and about our Noûz, which doesn't happen to be my favorite, but anyway, it's one of ours. And also speaks words of our poet, Moshi'i. And we hear them from the 5 young women who work in the White House in substantial positions that the first family has actually seen in their residence, not only in the official part of the White House. So that's good news. I think it can't be not good news. I'm sure that even the rhetoric from our side will soften up, and gradually there will be better days ahead for all of us. But we at the Foundation for Iranian Studies have had some rocky events and ups and downs in our work. One of the events that we have just had to look to has been the closure of our signature journal, Iranian, on its 30th year. You all know Iranian. It has been a wonderful journal. It started in 1982 and brought together the most important really function of it was it helped bring together scholars from every political sector, way of thinking, and it provided a space for dialogue, for debate, for analysis, for objectivity. And so in that sense, it has done a great deal for our community, both in diaspora and inside Iran. But you know, the closure of Iranian is basically something that has happened because of the changing of the times. There are very few of our original, or the first 10 years, or even first 15 or 20 years of constituency that are no longer either with us or no longer able to follow the scholarly Persian text. The young people rather read English. And even more important than that is the technology. Nobody even reads anymore, as you know, or if they read it's on one of the mobile or handheld devices. So a lot of journals have gone out of business, as you know, and the whole publishing business, as our friends here who are in publishing know, have changed. So it is nostalgic for us, and of course, we've had some of the most distinguished writers and editors working for Iranian. Dr. Matini, who was the founding editor of Iranian, is with us tonight. And unfortunately, his distinguished journal, Iran Shenasi, is also going toward the same fate, again because of the conditions of the times. And it's sort of, I'm sure for all of us here, Washingtonians, to have two such journals in this city, in this community, and to have both of them not any longer able to do what they used to do is sad, but at the same time, I'm sure that what has been done will stay and other activities will replace it. The foundation will be conducting research and publishing regularly and focus on research in areas that have been ignored, mostly 20th century and mid-20th century history and mid-20th century sociological and political and economic issues, and they will be published, and of course the digital dissemination will be a large part of that. So this is just to share with you as we will be here, the summing up of what has happened. We are here tonight to basically hear one of the most distinguished scholars of Iranian studies, Professor Ali Banuazizi, and I'm going to put my glasses on and read this because I don't want to say anything that is not exactly what I would like to say about him. And what I would like to say about him is that he is an extraordinary scholar and gentleman. He's professor of political science at Boston College. His scholarly interests include political cultures of the Middle East, comparative study of religion, civil society, and politics in the Middle East, and Iran's social history and contemporary domestic politics and foreign relations. Professor Banuazizi is currently the director of the program in Islamic civilization and societies and chair of the International Studies Academic Advisory Board at Boston College and fellow of the Center for International Studies, Massachusetts Institute of Technology. He is, and this is to me an extraordinary important accomplishment, he is, so far as I know, one of the two Iranians, both of them sitting here, who have been presidents of the Association of Middle Eastern Studies, and that's the collection of all professors and scholars who work in the Middle East. So we have in the last 30 years had two presidents, and our scholar tonight is one of them. And he has held visiting appointments at Princeton, Harvard, Hebrew University of Jerusalem, MIT, Oxford University. He has authored several books and innumerable articles on Iran, the Middle East, and culture and psychology. Basically, he's a psychologist, and I had the sort of been caught off guard by sitting next to him and starting to go all over the place with my thoughts and spontaneous recollections, and forgetting that this is his main field, because one sees him in so many different areas of study, but he's very astute and his psychological expertise is very much part of his achievements. He has been a frequent contributor to Iran, both as advisor, as contributor, and also as editor of special issues of Iran, and also has been a member of our advisory board with advice and counsel on all areas of the work. And so I am very pleased and honored to call on Dr. Ali Banuazizi, who's a good friend, a generous support for all Iranians in diaspora, especially who happen to be, especially those who are in academia, and a wonderful colleague of the foundation. So please welcome Dr. Ali Banuazizi.
Thank you so much. It's a great, very special honor for me to have been asked to give this Norûz lecture, the annual Norûz lecture for the Foundation for Iranian Studies. And I'm particularly grateful to Ms. Norûz and Dr. Banuazizi for granting me this privilege to come and talk about these issues. As you may have seen, the subject of my talk is Iranian intellectuals and the Islamic Revolution, then and now. And frankly, I wish I had a more cheerful topic that would match the celebratory mood of Norûz. But this has been my assignment, and I'll do my best. I should state at the outset that I'm also very mindful that my topic is closely tied to a rather charged question of who bears primary responsibility for the Islamic Revolution, and not, a revolution that did not quite turn out the way that millions of voters had hoped. And assuming, as many do, that a large part of that fault lies with the intellectuals of that era, when and how will these intellectuals repent for their historic folly? I'm aware that that question lingers, in the back of your minds. I think that's a pertinent question. But my goal in this talk is not to try to fix that blame or to offer an apology for it. In some ways, I carry part of that blame. And maybe this is defensive on my part, not to do that. That is not to try to fix that blame. So what I hope to do is to place the political ideas and sentiments of the Iranian intellectuals in the final 2 decades of the Pahlavi period in a somewhat broader socio-political context, to briefly assess their role in the 1979 revolution, to describe how they fared under the Islamic Republic, that is how these intellectuals fared under the Islamic Republic, after its triumph, after the triumph of the revolution, and to show how their concerns and the very nature of intellectual discourse has changed in the more recent years. Now, I know that that's a very tall order, and I probably won't be able to do it justice in any sense, but I'll try to at least hit on some of the key points. Perhaps before going any further, I should explain what I mean by intellectuals in the Iranian context during the period that we're considering. This has been a very contentious issue ever since the concept of enlightened thinkers, Munawwar al-Fikran, came into vogue in the last decade of the 19th century and the run-up to the constitutional revolution of 1905-1909. The term refers not so much to an occupational category, but to individuals who address important cultural, social, or political issues of their society publicly and with relative independence from the official mandates or ideologies of the state or other organized interests. It includes writers, poets, artists, journalists, religious and legal scholars, as well as academics, particularly in the social sciences and the humanities. I should note that I include, as you just heard, in my definition, both secular and religious intellectuals, as well as clerics, as long as they are not bound by the official clerical duties or strictly religious functions. While adopting an oppositional stance vis-à-vis the state or other political power holders is not a defining characteristic of intellectuals in any broad sense of the term. It's undeniable that in societies where freedom of thought and expression are severely restricted, there is an unavoidable tension between intellectuals and those in positions of power and authority. I'm personally not entirely comfortable or in agreement with limiting the meaning of the term intellectuals to what essentially amounts to the opposé intellectuals. I realize that there are many other intellectuals in our own recent history who did not fit that kind of definition, but surely and certainly they were intellectuals. But in the sense in which the word was used in the Iranian context during the period that I'm focusing on, it was indeed in this rather limited sense of those intellectuals who were independent of or often opposed to the established authorities and powers to varying degrees. So with that limitation placed on the meaning and my awareness that I'm not doing justice to the broader category of intellectuals and thinkers and scholars and activists. First, I want to focus then on the period before the revolution. The role that intellectuals have played in Iran's modern history has been the subject of considerable scholarly interest, and there are a number of excellent books written on this topic. Intellectuals as a small and relatively distinct group of thinkers and political activists began to be recognized in Iran, that is, in the last decades of the 19th century. They helped introduce such fundamental ideas, many borrowed from the French Enlightenment, of social progress, the nation, secularism, the rule of law, and popular sovereignty, and limits on the hitherto arbitrary powers of the monarch. They formed secret societies, civic-minded associations, and some published newspapers in exile that were smuggled into the country. Perhaps their greatest contributions, in league with a number of progressive clerical figures, was to expand and elevate the limited demand at the very early stages of the constitutional revolution for a demand for a house of justice, which was the initial cry of the protesters, to a far more ambitious and basic demand for a constitution and popular sovereignty, and in so doing, they were able to guide the first successful revolution in the Middle East that produced a constitutional monarchy similar to those in Europe. Their collaboration, that is between the intellectuals and the clergy, the progressive elements within the clergy, however, was relatively short-lived, as it became clear that the new constitution would establish a rather secular system of government with a limited role for the clergy. The intellectuals parted ways with the clergy and prevailed in ensuring that their largely secular constitutionalist vision, or mashrute, would not be replaced or compromised by the clergy's Sharia-based mashru'e form of government. Later, in the 1920s and 1930s, most intellectuals were supportive of Reza Shah's efforts to modernize and secularize Iran with the same ideological zeal as Kemal Atatürk was doing in neighboring Turkey. They helped in the development of a secular system of education, that is primary, secondary, as well as post-secondary. They rewrote the country's new civil, criminal, and commercial codes and took leading roles in modernizing many aspects of the country's cultural and social lives. But as the Reza Shah government became more autocratic in its style of rule, they began to withdraw their support and became increasingly alienated from his rule. A new phase in intellectual activism began with the application of Reza Shah, and during the Second World War, from 1941 to 45. It was in this period that primarily the leftist intellectuals, most of whom associated with the newly formed Tudeh party, began to champion a number of progressive ideas and causes. Later, after a temporary ban on the overt activities of the party, of the Tudeh party, the Tudeh members became once again quite active in Mossadegh's old nationalization movement and in the early 1950s. Now, in the aftermath of the fall of Mossadegh, and for the next quarter of the century, now we're coming to the more recent period, strict government censorship removed any possibility of independent political parties, civic associations, or critical and open-minded or open discourse on critical issues. And this at a time that the country was experiencing a period of unprecedented economic growth and major advances in the expansion of higher education, openness to the West, women's economic and social status, including suffrage rights, and a variety of other reforms that took place during this period. During this period, quite in contrast to the earlier generation of intellectuals who had spoken against the country's economic balance and had vied for modernization, industrialization, social and economic development, and Western-style standards of material and cultural consumption. In spite of, that was the stance of the earlier generation of intellectuals. But no sooner had the state under Mohammad Reza Shah had begun to break its ties with religious and traditional forces, invest in modern industry, and encourage Western culture in the 1960s, and to engage in a variety of social and economic reforms, that the intelligentsia or intellectuals began to make what looked like a U-turn. This was not development, they argued, but dependency on Western imperialism, promoting the interests of the comprador bourgeoisie and the capitalists dependent on the West and serving Western interests. Land reform had been carried out on the orders of the Kennedy administration, they argued, partly to forestall the danger of a socialist revolution and partly to provide a better market for Western consumer goods. This line of thinking, this type of critique, this stance continued. Intellectuals were mostly critical of the gulf between the rich and the poor, of what we call exploitation, class struggle, imperialism, dependency, and the answer increasingly became, for many of them, a transformative and revolutionary change. The ideal societies at this time that were portrayed by these intellectuals were initially, of course, Soviet Union, socialism in one country, but gradually it shifted to China for the more radical elements within the intellectual community. And it continued until pretty much the onset of the revolution in Iran. I must say, and you may disagree with this, that had our leftist intellectuals come to power, the kind of government that we would have had would have been very similar to what happened in Afghanistan. I followed the Afghan situation very closely during those years, and I'm not talking about the Taliban movement, I'm talking about the so-called Sour Revolution that took place in 1978 in Afghanistan. As you may, those of you who followed Afghan affairs would remember that there was a coalition between Parcham and Khalq, the pro-Soviet and the pro-Chinese parties, and that paved the way for a Marxist-Leninist revolution. And quite paradoxically, and I know this firsthand, at least in part, the invasion of Afghanistan was to tamp down the kind of radicalism that took place in those months after the revolution, in the Marxist-Leninist revolution. Now, I want to shift away from this particular streak in the orientation of intellectuals, that is the Marxist-Leninist, the leftist, Trotskyite, and a whole variety of other orientations. I want to shift away to other orientations at this time in Iran. And this time now really refers to the 1960s, late 1960s and 1970s. As you know, a shift occurred in the Iranian intellectual community, and that was a shift in the framework that made the connection between, that is argued for authenticity, anti-Westernism, nativism, and in this regard, very well-known work by initially the statements by Fardid, and eventually the book by Jalal al-Ahmad played a key role. And I think, as you all know, al-Ahmad was not by any means alone in promoting this point of view. Many others joined. Ehsan al-Arawi was another intellectual who joined the movement, and several others. So this became now a very important orientation, this kind of anti-Westernism or machinism, the critique of the West, and a plea for return to the Iranian self. Now, everything that I'm talking about in terms of the role of intellectuals essentially is about the role of ideas in a revolution. That is, the extent to which ideas can move, can mobilize, can promote a revolutionary movement. Now, the ideas are not sufficient, they're not enough to mobilize people, to motivate people to take risks. A revolution is about extremism, it's about taking risks, about the willingness to die for your ideas and ideals. So something more than these ideas was necessary to mobilize revolution, many things more. Quite aside from the structural causes of the revolution. And here I want to, in a sense, focus on and make a digression into another topic. And that is, perhaps surprising to you, the theme that was introduced at about this time, the theme of martyrdom in the revolutionary discourse at the time. And it was in the 1960s that a new interpretation of martyrdom occurred in Iran. Now, of course, martyrdom in Shiism is a very foundational concept. The Shi'i imams, with the exception of the 12, were believed to have endured great suffering in the hands of tyrannical rulers, in part in order to redeem humanity. In the case of the third Shi'i Imam Hussein, the Lord of the Martyrs, it was believed that he allowed himself to be killed in the plains of Karbala in 680 AD in fulfilling his commitment to justice and to promote righteousness. For this reason, he was often referred to as Mazlum, that is Hussein, which literally means injured, oppressed, or sinned against, but also one who, in spite of being wronged, refrained from acting against others out of a sense of dignity, forbearance, and nobility. There were, of course, other martyrs in the pantheon of Shiism, but their number was relatively limited, and none could achieve as lofty a status in the eyes of the Shiis as Hussein. In short, martyrdom was associated with redemptive suffering, nobility, whose tales would elicit deep sorrow, sometimes taken to frenzied levels, as you know, and as such, it deserved an occasion, a very high occasion, in Shi'i rituals and theology. But this entire conception of martyrdom came under question, and a new conception began to arise at this time. As many of you know, it was in the late 1960s, 67, 68, that a new book was published, an important turning point in this discussion or understanding of the notion of martyrdom. The author was Saleh Najafabadi, and it was called the immortal martyr Shahid Javid. What Salehi argued was that Hussein began his movement neither to fulfill his grandfather's forebodings, that is, Prophet Muhammad's forebodings, nor in reckless mood of defiance, but as a wholly rational and fairly well-planned attempt at overthrowing the regime of Yazid. Motivated thus by a combination of political and religious considerations to start his rebellion, he took all the precautions that a responsible political leader should take before embarking on his momentous enterprise. So the collapse of the rebellion in Karbala was entirely due to objective, rational causes with no room left for the vagaries of supernatural powers. So the quiescent character of the drama of Karbala started to change at the hands of Saleh Najafabadi and a number of other Shiites at about this time. And these included, by the way, Ayatollah Montazeri and Meshkini, both of whom achieved very high positions, of course, in the Islamic Republic. And indeed, the younger generation, students at Iranian University, wrote a very highly publicized letter thanking the author for this remarkably rational and motivating book and this new interpretation. He said, "We sincerely congratulate you for writing this book, a work that elucidates the real face of the bloody uprising of Karbala." Interestingly, Savak tried to counter this argument. They had another cleric write a book, and they distributed 20,000 copies of a rebuttal to Shahid Javid, but that did not really work. Now, this message was picked up by a number of people. I'll mention Khomeini in a moment, but Shariati was one who appropriated this idea, and he wrote, and this very famous passage, "A shaheed is the heart of history. The heart gives blood and life to the otherwise dead blood vessels of the body. Like the heart, a shaheed sends his own blood into the half-dead body of a dying society whose children have lost faith in themselves, which is slowly approaching death. The greatest miracle of Shahadat is giving to a generation a renewed faith in itself. A shaheed is an ever-present, everlasting personage in history." It was this mode of thinking that Khomeini picked up and elaborated on. It's very interesting that right about this time, when this book was gaining great notoriety in Iran, a number of clerics wrote to Khomeini and asked his opinion in the manner of an istifta. And there were a number of questions that they had raised, and he responded to every question and chose not to comment on this particular portrayal of Imam Hussein and the whole concept of that. So, because he knew that this would be an extremely important way for motivating people and making the martyrdom of Hussein into a rousing revolutionary slogan. And Shariati continued with his mission of an Islamic liberation, a blueprint for a revolutionary transformation of the social order, and he continued to emphasize the theme of martyrdom, as did many other clerics and others. When I say others, I mean really other activists in the Iranian Revolution, including leftists, who in their trials, in their various statements, would identify themselves very openly with Imam Hussein and would talk about their mission being a mission of Shahadat. And at this time, with all this movement to motivate young people to participate, still the clergy were not playing an active role in the movement. This is something which is often forgotten. Khomeini was very much aware that he needed to motivate and mobilize the clergy. And here's a very interesting passage that relates to our theme, that is the theme of the intellectuals. He is now addressing primarily the intellectuals. He says, they, meaning the intellectuals or intelligentsia, should not push aside the clergy who are backed by the masses and say, we want an Islam without clerics. This was, by the way, the battle cry of Shariati, that in his vision of a classless, utopian society, the clerics would play no role. So Khomeini continued, it's like saying that we want an Islam without politics. This goes against reason. Islam without clerics is totally impossible. Every mullah is influential in his own quarters, but you do not have such influence, you meaning the intellectuals. The people want the clergy. If a cleric is not sufficiently versed in political matters, give him the information so that he can act and persuade people to follow the lead of you. So he is very much aware that he needs to mobilize the ranks and file of the clerics at that time. And we see this continuing. I'll come to that in just a moment. But at about this time, the secular intellectuals become mobilized, not only through the framework of martyrdom, but in various other ways, of course. The Iranian Writers Association become active during this time. The association was formed back in 1964, but now in 1977, they regroup and they hold meetings. There is an opening in the political system. And of course, the famous 10 Nights of Poetry are organized in November of 1977. And it's about this point that the whole question of human rights becomes more paramount in the discourse of the United States and Europe, and there are openings in Iran. There's a relaxation of censorship, freedom for some political prisoners, so the intellectuals are very much on the scene. And of course, all of this ultimately mobilizes, the masses. We have the sparks of the revolution, the letter that gets published in Etela'at, and there is the matter of Cinema Rex, which at the time everyone was absolutely certain was the work of the regime, but it turned out to have been indeed an act by the same people who had been against the corrupt Western culture, and that was brought out in the trial after the revolution. Now, when the revolution became triumphant, when it ultimately succeeded, and I don't need to review those events, I want to focus on what happened to the intellectuals. It did not take very long after the fall of the Pahlavi regime for the clerical supporters of Khomeini to consolidate their power. Now, some people talk about this as a coup that took place within the ranks of the revolutionaries. I take a somewhat different stance on this issue. I do believe that something very fundamental took place at this time, but this was at the ideological level, not necessarily at the political level. Here I quote a long passage again from Khomeini. Now he has returned to Iran. Now he's in a position of power. Now we are going beyond the uses of Islam as an ideological tool, which was the achievement of the pre-revolutionary intellectuals, to take advantage of Islamic teachings, of the rituals of martyrdom, and various other kinds of Islamic symbols to mobilize the masses. That I would call the politicization of religion. Okay? Obviously, it took place, and probably more so than any place else at that time, at least, in the world, that religion was politicized. To some degree, liberation theology in Latin America was a parallel to that. But in Iran, obviously, not only religion was mobilized, but it was mobilized to an extent to initiate and to bring a revolution to a successful end. But now the revolution has happened, and as you recall, the slogans of the revolution were freedom, independence, and Islamic republic. Very few people knew what that meant. Very few intellectuals had actually read Khomeini's Islamic government, I must admit. I read it only, I believe it was in October of 1977. But I didn't take it seriously. I thought that these were, of course, the pronouncements of a cleric, that he would return to Iran and probably continue in the clerical spiritual guidance and in that kind of role. But Khomeini obviously was very clear-headed and very certain as to what his intention was. Now, here I'm quoting from the anniversary of the 1963 riots, which, from their point of view, was the beginning of the Islamic Revolution. In the official, portrayal, or official history of the revolution, it begins with the riots of 1963, 1342. So he is now talking to an audience shortly after the revolution, and he says, let's see who they are, these people who created the movement of Khordad 15th and suffered the loss of 15,000 martyrs that day, not to mention those who rushed forward to great martyrdom in other massacres that have occurred since then. Now, this is a very, in case you didn't pay attention to the figure that I just read, the 15,000 people who died, who were massacred, who became martyrs in 1963 in the uprisings led by Khomeini. That's a very important figure to keep in mind. 15,000. Do you realize what the actual figure was of the people who were in fact killed in June of 1963? The actual figure for that day, 15 Khordad, was 32. Okay, 32 people were killed on 15 Khordad. What source do I have to make such a claim in clear contradiction to what Imam Khomeini said? Well, the source is absolutely reliable. It's the Bunyad Shahid in Iran. For the past 37 years, Bunyad Shahid has worked on identifying all the martyrs of the revolution, of the Islamic Revolution, from 1963 to the Bahman of 1357, to February of 1979. Okay, so you can see that, going back to my idea about martyrdom, how that idea is being presented, how it's being exaggerated as foundation for the movement and affirmation that the martyrs were the ones to whom the revolution belongs. Now, again, I want to take a digression here. We have heard that in the Iranian Revolution, the slogan was "Dahha hezar kushte, sadha hezar zakhmi." That is, the figure that was used was 60,000, 70,000 dead in the course of the Iranian Revolution. This is now not going back to 1963, but in the revolutionary year itself. Once again, the actual figure, and this was a figure that was used by Khomeini time and again, and it was used by members of the parliament and by various spokespeople of the regime. Okay? Now, we've done considerable research on this point, the casualties of the revolution. The actual number, again, these are from Bunyad Shahid and a couple of other sources, but there's complete agreement of these very reliable sources. The actual figure of casualties of the Iranian Revolution from 1342 to 1357, that entire period, is 3,164. Okay, that's the total number. That's very important when you compare that. And once again, it's the theme of martyrdom. And by the way, these figures are also reported, analyzed in great detail in the book by Imaduddin Baqi, on the Iranian Revolution, which was published in Iran. He could not have possibly fabricated these figures because this is an extremely sensitive issue, and Baqi would have been in jail as a very recognized, religious intellectual. Okay. So continuing now with Khomeini, he says, from the 15th of Khordad until today, everything that has been accomplished has been the activity of Muslims from the lower echelons of society by their devotion and sacrifice, their martyrdom. They are the ones who deserve to have their opinions heard as to what is to be done. Those people who were abroad and have recently come back, those who were not in the ranks of the movement and have only recently joined it, have no claims on the movement, or their opinions have no validity whatsoever. The xenomaniacs, people infatuated with the West, the intellectuals, the intelligentsia, empty people. These are people with no content, who have no role and no place in our government. So he advocates now an Islamic government. Here is, in my judgment, a very fundamental change that occurred in the revolution. That is, from the politicization of Islam, which is not an extraordinary event. In many other societies, we have seen religion politicized, to what I would call the sacralization of politics, the sacralization of the state. Okay? That's a very fundamental shift. If you take it that way, then there is really no room for those who are not true believers, who do not belong to the clerical ranks, or whose total commitment to the faith is in question. So now it is politics that becomes sacralized. And that's an obvious statement in a sense, because we see very quickly that immediately after the referendum that took place in Iran, we have the Assembly of Experts, and it drafted the Vilayat al-Faqih, and that obviously is a sacred state. It's God's government on earth. That was the intent. And the Faqih, of course, as everybody knows, he rules in the name of the Imam, of the Imam. So a fundamental change took place, and it, in my judgment, completely transformed the very intellectual atmosphere or ideologies, that had existed until that time. Okay. Now, this, by the way, all came as shocking to people, including Bazargan, who said, where did this come from? This was not our understanding of the Islamic Republic, but the change had occurred. Now, what did the intellectuals do? Because this was not hidden, it came out, it became very obvious. Well, here, I think one has to be very careful not to lump them all together. There are many different reactions among the intellectuals. I believe the worst reaction came from the members of the Tudeh party, who absolutely and unconditionally, as intellectuals, not as apparatchik, as intellectuals, supported the regime. As you remember, Khalkhali was their, the candidate that they supported for the first parliament, and for them, as long as the mission of Khomeini, in spite of this sacral image for people who were, secularists, obviously, atheists, as long as this sacral image was anti-imperialist, that was good enough. Right? Now, in reality, one shouldn't blame them too much, because this was the position of the Soviet Union, and they were indeed carrying out, I think, the general policies of the Soviets. But other intellectuals reacted differently. And here we have really quite a variety of reactions. Some pulled away, some adopted a quietist approach, some became very, sort of totally disillusioned. They left. Indeed, tens of thousands of intellectuals left after the revolution. And others tried to make peace with the regime. But a significant segment of the intellectual community, the so-called religious intellectuals, they stayed and they began a movement which I think continues today. It's very easy to dismiss them, to say that they're just paving the way for the regime and so on and so forth. But in reality, what they have accomplished has been important for political Islam, let's say. And in so far as and as long as Islam is going to be part of our politics, it seems to me that the role that the reformist intellectuals play can indeed be a positive role. I'll say a few words about that later on. Now, of the people who suffered the consequences of their opposition to the new Islamic Republic, let me only mention the massacres that took place in 1988, the summer of 1988, and here the numbers are truly disturbing and unprecedented. According to the most careful reviews, somewhere between 2,800 to 3,800 people were killed. These were people who were in prison, many of them members of the Mujahideen and Fadayan and various other groups, who at the conclusion of the Iran-Iraq War, according to two secret directives from Khomeini, they were put to death. And we don't have an episode like that in modern Iranian history. Then, of course, we have, in the years following that massacre, a number of intellectuals who were killed. And here, Saidi Sirjani, Ahmad Tafazzoli, of course, the two members of the Writers' Union, Mohammad Mukhtari and Mohammad Jafar Puyande, were among the people who actually lost their lives, as well as Dariush and Parvane Furuhaq. Okay, these are the best known ones. There are obviously a number of others. So a very costly period. Okay. Now, since the revolution, the intellectual life of the country obviously has not ended. I think it would be a grave mistake to think that the contemporary Iranian youth and intellectuals are silent, that they have been decommissioned. This is not at all true. In fact, it seems to me that depending on what perspective one takes on Iranian society, whether you look at it from top down, meaning focusing on the Islamic Republic and its operatives and so on, or whether you have a bottom-up view of society, you really come up with very different images of what is happening in Iran and in intellectual life in Iran. To talk about this new intellectual life, one should first look at some of the remarkable changes that have taken place in Iranian society, that is, demographically, if you will, sociologically. The population, compared to 36 million, we now have 80 million. 64% of Iranians are below the age of 35. The literacy rate in Iran has shot up. It's 87%, and 98% of those between the ages of 15 and 24 are indeed literate, according to the statistics that we have. That's a remarkable number. More relevant to our theme, intellectual life, intelligentsia, there are roughly 4.4 million students enrolled in institutions of higher learning, compared to what I recall as 100 to 250,000 students at the time of the revolution. That's a remarkable shift, 4.4 million. And interestingly, over 2 million of these students are in the fields of humanities and social sciences. That's why we hear so much about the need to Islamize the curriculum, to close down certain fields, and to fire professors who are not fully committed to the positions and ideas of the Islamic Republic, and so on and so forth. Beyond the number of young people who are in actually institutions of higher learning, there are about 7.5 million Iranians, or about 14% of the country's population, working age population, who have completed university level education. This makes Iran the most educated country in the Middle East. This is very, really quite remarkable. Okay? So the context has changed. The audience has changed from the time of the pre-revolutionary period. That's a very obvious point. The understanding that young people have of their own society has changed dramatically. What the young people know today about Iranian economy, about Iranian society, about politics, about world politics, compared to my generation, is truly remarkable. It's much, much greater and more impressive. Beyond that, of course, the means of communications have changed. The openness, Iran is not a closed society. The openness to the rest of the world, the connection that the young people in Iran, this highly educated population of Iranians, 7.5 million that I mentioned, highly urbanized, highly educated, the connection that they have to the outside world, the connection that they have to the hundreds of websites everywhere in the world, and the openness with which issues are discussed in a relatively democratic fashion outside of Iran, and to some degree, getting into a number of controversies even inside of Iran. All of that is changing. Now, bear in mind, I'm still trying to continue with this bottom-up view of the society. I'm not talking about the degree of censorship and repression and so on, or attempts at those, closures from the top. I'm looking at it from the perspective of, if you will, the intelligentsia in Iran. So there are all these and many, many other changes. I don't want to go on for too long on this, that the context has changed, and of course there are hundreds of thousands of Iranians in diaspora who have a very organic intellectual link to the population back home. All of that is also very new. And the means of communications. Remember how Khomeini's cassettes used to get imported into Iran, and who would hear them, compared to what young people, indeed everyone, can hear today. So going beyond the changes in context, we look at the contents of what intellectual concerns are today, I would argue that the contents, that is the issues with which Iranian intellectuals are concerned, has changed rather dramatically. The notion of the West has been completely transformed. You know, this imperialist West compared to the highly idealized Chinese society, which has now a much larger number of billionaires than the United States, you know, Soviet Union compared to Russia, and you know, and everything else that has changed in the world. So the West is no longer, except of course in the minds of the ideologues of the regime, who continue to harangue at the West, and the Norûz West, and so on and so forth. But as far as the population, and this relatively educated population, and that's my subject matter, the intellectuals, the intelligentsia, as far as that segment of the population is concerned, the meaning of the West and the aspirations to learn, to come to the West, to understand, you know, the products of the West, scholarship, culture, music, you know, literature, and so on, all of that. I mean, just look at the number of literary magazines, cultural magazines in Iran that are published and carry, you know, translations of everything that gets published here. So there's great interest in the West, and the idea of, you know, Westitis or Weststruckness and those things are totally meaningless. Okay. Now, the changes beyond this notion of the West. I think one of the most important changes that have taken place is indeed in the very conception, in the very understanding of Islam itself. For the first time in the study of Islam, we are beginning to see the bringing in of historical scholarship onto religious matters. You know, who wrote the Quran, at what time, under what circumstances, what do these hadiths, what do they mean, who wrote them, interpretations of these, not in accordance with true belief, but in accordance with historical sources, contrary sources, and so on and so forth. So, and this is extremely important. This is what happened in Western Christianity. It was not until the fusion of scholarship, historical scholarship, and religious ideas that there could be a reformation or an enlightenment, not the reformation, in the West. We are beginning to see a wholly new understanding of Islam itself. And there are a number of important figures, many of them are in diaspora. You know, one can think of Khadivar, for example, who questions very and based on historical scholarship the notion of Vilayat Faqih, and he dismisses the notion as having no precedent in Islamic fiqh and theology. And you know, there are a number of them in Iran itself, Qabil, you know, somebody that read a fair amount of, and various others. So this is one change in Islam. And beyond that, of course, we have, you know, for example, the work of Norûz, no matter what one thinks of his early involvements with the Cultural Revolution in Iran, it's a fact that his distinction between religion and human understanding of religion is a very important one, because it makes our religious doctrines, our religious teachings, contingent upon the circumstances in which they were presented, in which they evolved, and various other kinds of cultural limitations on those understandings of religion, and many, many others. So that's one change which did not exist prior to the theological schools in Qom, in Iraq, and so on. they did not focus on these kinds of issues. They were not interested in this highly rationalistic and scholarly historical approach to the understanding of religion. But there are other changes that have occurred. The notion of freedom and democracy. These are ideas, as those of you who belong to my generation would remember, they were abstract ideas, and they always referred to or were applied to the collectivity. The entire Iranian nation would be free or unfree. Okay? They did not, the notion of individual freedom, individual liberty, did not have a place in the lexicon of the pre-revolutionary Iranian intellectuals. I can speak about that. I remember those days. Right? And this has changed. For the first time, notions of social freedom, notion of personal freedom, these have become part of the concerns of intellectuals, and we see that in many different ways. We hear now for the first time the notions of civil society, that there are aspects of social life, of political life, between the private sphere and the governmental sphere, that are extremely important for the existence, for the functioning of a democracy and so on. And these ideas have entered the consciousness of Iranians, of young Iranians, intelligentsia. Minority rights have become at least recognized by the more enlightened segments of the Iranian society, much more so than ever before. We saw, for example, that in the treatment that is in the various attacks and various discriminations and repressions of the Baha'is, the Iranian intellectuals, albeit in diaspora, for the first time in the history of the country, wrote a letter. You remember the title was Ma Sharmginin. We are ashamed of our silence for the past 150 years. Now, obviously, it's going to take a very long time before such ideas make a real difference in the treatment of the religious minorities, including the Sunnis, by the way, in Iran. But at least we find that in intellectual circles, such matters are brought up and acknowledged, at least. The position of women and the discourse on women's issues has also changed in Iran, thanks in part to diaspora activists, but also inside of Iran. When one thinks, for example, of Simine Behbahani, when one thinks of Nasrin Sotoudeh, and various other women activists. And indeed, the whole attempt to develop a feminist perspective within Islam, so-called Islamic feminism. Whether or not one agrees with that is not the issue. The fact that there is this kind of consciousness among people who want to maintain their faith and yet acknowledge and promote women's rights. Now, I don't want to idealize these movements. All I'm claiming is that this is a society that has changed and is changing. The demographic base has changed, the educational base has changed, and if you will, in the coming years, perhaps not in my lifetime, but there will have to be a change in the directions that these concerns reflect. I think I'd like to stop there and respond to questions that you might have. would you kindly identify yourself if you don't mind?
My name is Yassi Saadad. Thank you very much for your very interesting topic. You ended your speech on a high note, I would say, that a lot of changes are happening that could bring potentially a moderation in that country. What would you say are the main obstacles? And I really make it an open-ended question in the sense that can it be outside, if the external forces would be the biggest obstacle, or the internal? If you could, how would you see this trend getting arrested and reversed again?
Well, the obstacles are internal, first of all. I don't believe that the obstacles lie outside. And this, by the way, is a major, major shift that has occurred in all our thinking. We used to attribute everything, of course, to the great powers and so on and so forth.
We can't hear you.
We used to attribute, we used to understand everything that was, bad in our society to the foreigners, to the outside powers, to imperialism and the like. I think we've realized that the internal obstacles are far more important and substantial. I believe that this idea that I began to, that I presented to you, that is the religious, sacralized foundation of the regime, Velayat Faqih, if you will. And those who use this in order to maintain their power. This, of course, the legitimizing ideology of the regime. That's the obstacle. So, if you will, it's Velayat Faqih. Behind that Velayat Faqih, there's a formidable force which, in my judgment, has the ability, the willingness of using coercive power to the maximum necessary to prevent any kind of, democratic change, contestation, if you will, similar to what happened in the Green Movement. Okay? That is, I'm convinced that they are prepared to assert the authority of the state. Okay? And they've got great ideology. This is all in the name of God's government on earth. Yes, sir.
Thank you for your speech. Since we're all part of the diaspora here, how much really do we have impact on what is happening in the world?
How much impact we have? I think the connections that we have are quite substantial. They read, people read, they watch, they connect, and so on. Now, obviously, those who are inside the country, they're the ones who are going to play any real role in bringing about any change. But we're part of it. We do have, I don't know about impact, but we're connected. I think all of us. Yeah. Why don't you take the questions out? Yeah.
So I want to go back to the 60s.
Yes.
And the implication of your presentation is that really, when we talk about intellectuals, we're talking about oppositional intellectuals. Now, I want to, if you look at the early 60s, we have the White Revolution, and there is a framework, and there's some type of intellectual framework and stuff like that, which over time seems to lose its steam. And by the time we get to the revolution, really nobody's buying. So, what is it that happened? What happened? Why is it that the regime itself could not articulate some kind of a vision that in the marketplace of ideas and intellectual ideas, people will buy into. I mean, what was it about the regime and what was the framework that people weren't buying? What was going on there?
Yeah. Of course, there are many other people who are more qualified to answer that question, but I will do my best. Remember, I said I feel uncomfortable limiting the term intellectuals to the opposite intellectuals, the opposition intellectuals. Because obviously, precisely during the period that you're talking about, in fact, if you think of the group around Mansour and Ubaidah and so on, they were intellectuals as well. But remember, I justified my narrow definition by saying that that's how Iranians referred to Roshan Fikran. You know, they meant usually, you know, the opposite intellectuals. Why didn't these other, and if you go back to the Reza Shah period, there were a substantial number of intellectuals who participated, you know, in the judiciary, you know, various other capacities in Iran, and of course they continued under the Shah as well. Okay. I really have no better explanation than saying that in those years, the political atmosphere in the third world, you know, was a leftist atmosphere. It was a nationalist atmosphere up to a point, you know, particularly after the Mossadegh period. But leftist ideas came to define intellectualism. Let me give you a couple of examples. Jean-Paul Sartre said, I have no religion. If I had a religion, it would be Shariati's religion. Can you imagine Jean-Paul Sartre saying that? Michel Foucault, coming to Iran, reported on the casualties, exactly the same figures as the opposition was giving. And he was there as a reporter, you know. He would not do a critical, you know, observation or anything of the sort. And was obviously very much fascinated by the Iranian Revolution for reasons that were perhaps unique to him. So that was the atmosphere. You know, I must confess, I was, at least in part, a member of that formation, if you will. I remember in student organizations, this is now in the 60s, early 60s, I parted ways, you know, mid-60s. You know, we would have these resolutions that would come at the end of each annual meeting of the Iranian Student Association, you probably remember. And it was Mozambique, Angola, and so on and so forth, countries which at the time I didn't really know, but it was part of the lexicon. It was what we were all moved by, okay? Never did any of us talk about Soviet imperialism in Central Asia. I mean, those were obviously, you know, colonies as well. Never, not once, did anyone raise that question.
We can take two more questions and please start.
Thank you for your lecture. I have a broad question, but with a specific angle.
Okay.
And this is about gender equality and the intellectuals involved.
Yeah.
Why have been Iranian intellectuals in particular so retrogressive on gender equality at the time of peace and revolution, but especially so the leftist intellectuals,
Right.
which stands out in terms of their total retrogressive notion of gender equality?
I think that question is exactly about what she's a board member.
I don't know if gender was an issue at the time. You know, I mean, you were, yes, retrogressive, right? No, for the intellectuals.
I don't have a question. Okay.
For the intellectuals. No, I know that. No, of course I realize that. No. But at the time, in the quotes, intellectual circles, gender was not an issue. Perhaps there were a few slogans, but it was not a central issue. You know, colonialism was an issue, you know, but gender was not an issue at the time. Please understand that.
Two points. One was the interesting thing, especially at the beginning of the Islamic Revolution, was the fact that there was also quite a rift and a divide between the so-called traditional clerics, the grand ayatollahs, like Shariat Madawi, and Khomeini, which makes it also interesting, because this fundamentalism is basically a Western entity. It's interesting that they would be attacking the Shah and secular intellectuals as agents of the West, but Shariati himself is Sartre and Fanon. Ahmad, again, Sartre and Fanon. Then you go to Sayyid Qutb and you go to Khomeini, you find fascism and communism. That was one point that I would like for you perhaps to elaborate. Then I have something to say about women.
That's great, but please go back to your very interesting, important point that there was a rift between or within the clerical establishment. You're absolutely right. That was why I said Khomeini realized that he had to mobilize the clerical establishment, which was by and large quite conservative, you know. And there are many instances in which he speaks to them, and believe it or not, he says, "Look at these, you know, intellectuals. They, you know, they do this, they do that, and nothing happens to them. Why don't you do something?" You know, speaking to the clerics. You're absolutely right. Yeah.
And one other, as you know, you were talking. I mean, the talk. As you said, the topic was not cheerful, but it was very illuminating and pleasurable, actually. So one of the things that you went from from the constitutional revolution to the present, and one interesting issue seems to be that at the time of constitutional revolution, the forces that came to the foreground were not just political, but also forebearers of ideas, and you know, when Sheikh Fazlullah ibn Norûz was objecting to the revolution, it was novel education, public education of women, journalism, all of these which they returned to. And what I found interesting about the leftist intellectuals during and before the revolution was how much behind we were in terms of issues that the constitutional revolution had already brought to the foreground, and until the end of the Pahlavi reign, they were very important, and actually they created the fundamental, they created the background to why women today are so active, because they have a history that they are going back to, the Iranian women go back to. But they sided with Khomeini. I mean, at the time of Khomeini's issuing the issue around, they were talking about the way Sherikoi Fadayi Khan and the left were saying that these are bourgeois individualist demands, and you know, so they were paying attention, but from the wrong angle.
There was sort of instrumental use by Khomeini of the intellectuals and of Khomeini by intellectuals. You know. Yeah, it went both ways. I mean, they thought that, we'll have the revolution, but we'll push them out, as you will.
There was actually 3 more questions.
Sure.
We're way over time, but...
I'll be very brief.
Okay, everybody, just 30 seconds. Yes, yeah.
Which of these 2 main tasks was Iranian of war or of Najaf, which they will accept to apply the modern peace? Not the democracy, the modern peace.
Should we take 3 questions?
Sure.
First of all, thank you, Paris Teacher from GW. Thank you so much for this wonderful talk and bringing together so many different topics. I know that there is a lot to talk about every single thing, but I just want to say something, especially since the gender issue came up, is that everything going back to the 60s, actually everything you read from these so-called intellectuals is sort of perpetuating this very sexist discourse. Jalal al-Ahmad, these are like semi-intellectuals who are not even clergy or clericals, but they are perpetuating this very discourse that has become a problem for Iran today.
After all these discussions, it's not clear to me what is your exact definition of intellectual. In Iran, many people call themselves, or they were called intellectual, but if you look at their actions, their judgments, their writings, they were guided by their emotions and their feelings, and not by the logical and rational aspect of their mind, the so-called intellect. So I want to know what is the exact term that you use, what you understand by the word intellect.
And one more, and that's the end. Just wait.
I was wondering if you think that Iranian intellectuals lost their relevance as a result of the betrayal that the masses felt after the revolution because of their overwhelming support for the Khomeini's regime and the Khomeini's ideology that was supported by the Iranian intellectuals, that Iranian intellectuals lost their relevance and also people felt betrayed by the intellectuals.
ببخشید من میخوام یه تاریخچه کوچیکی بگم که مربوط به خانم افغانی بشه. خانم افغانی وقتی که حقوق زنان رو روشگار میکردن یه روز به من زنگ زدن، البته من خودم دائمی سیخ میزدم که من 3 تا بچه داشتم و شوهرم فوت کرده بود و در نتیجه اداره سرپرستی میخواست کنترل کنه زندگی بچه‌های من. مهناز جان خیلی کمک کرد به من و واقعا اینو گذروندن از طریق حالا خانم ملکه بود یا هر کسی به هر حال اینو گذشت به من و گفت برو قیم نامه تو بگیر. منم رفتم و گفتم من میخوام قیم نامه رو گرفتم ولی من مطمئنم I'm sorry I spoke in Farsi. I'm sorry, you will translate to the next word. And then I got my paper and I was so happy about this and it solved all my problems. But I discovered that no woman in Iran found out about that. They sent them to the people that were supposed to help their women, but they went into their doors because of the mullahs. They were afraid of that. So it was quietened down, but it still exists. And when I took, now they're passed the law because women reacted to this. They passed the law that husbands have to, at the time of the ceremony, in the they have to ask and we give them a form and they sign it. And so the women have a right to do that. But how many women know about this? I don't know.
Thank you so much, Asafia. Of course, Dr. Banuazizi will respond to the questions. But it's very important what you're bringing up about the past, considering your own background and who your mom is. Would you say that? Would you say that?
What?
You say that.
Huh? Oh, my mom. Well, they would swear at me. My mother was my nephew. And Giovanni was my father, second father. And very dear and a very good man.
Very interesting experience. Thank you so much.
Bye-bye, love.
So, thank you very much. You should watch this now. Whatever you can.
Right. I mean, on the women's issue, I just want to emphasize that I was talking about the absence of the topic in the intellectual circles. You know, of course, I'm aware that things were happening in Iranian society, and there were ardent supporters and promoters and advocates for women and so on and so forth, but in the intellectual circles, in this narrow definition with which I had to work. Now, going back to your point, of course, intellectuals made huge mistakes, misreadings. I even gave you the example of the Afghan intellectuals, you know, and the kinds of radicalism, you know, that they promoted and led to the disaster that is Afghanistan today. So intellectuals do not, you know, operate from, you know, position of reason, you know, information, analysis, and so on and so forth, you know. No, they operate, you know, from, you know, based on their specialty, on their political views, their ideologies. I mean, it's a role that some people play. Okay?
But in the West, they are called pseudo-intellectuals.
But let me just,
They don't use the intellect.
it's interesting, you know, the word intellectual, that is Roshan Fikr, you know, Munawwar al-Fikr, came into use in Iran at about the same time that the word intellectuel in France. And it was around a very political issue. It was the so-called Dreyfus affair, and a very famous French novelist, Émile Zola, wrote a famous letter called J'accusais, I accuse. And that created a movement, you know. It was a very important movement, and intellectuals as a group were recognized following that movement. So again, we all have to understand that we are not talking about intellectuals as the carriers of truth, if you will, or necessarily even of well-reasoned, rational, logical viewpoints. No, that has never been the case. But it's an important role in society. You see, this is very important to keep in mind. It's the only game in town. You know, there is no other way of, you know, bringing young people together, motivating them. They resonate to these things. You know.
I want to thank Dr. Banuazizi for a very, very interesting history of intellectual, the evolution of intellectual critique through the years before and after the revolution. There was, as you noticed, a bit of complaint about the gender aspect. And I think that we should have it back here one time to discuss the gender aspect. And also, I want to point to the lady absolutely proud who made this comment about guardianship of children and our conversation about her getting the guardianship of children. Her mother, as she mentioned, Mariam Firouz, was a leader of the Marxist movement, the today Marxist movement in Iran, and the fact that my own background has been very bourgeois, very middle class, very non, what do you call it, violent, and she and I and our mothers and our backgrounds nevertheless can understand each other, appreciate each other, and did it even in Iran before the revolution. I have to say there's something about women and women's ways of relating, women's ways of activism, women's ways of appreciating each other, whether intellectuals understood them or not, we need to celebrate. But I don't want to distract from the wonderful presentation of Dr. Banuazizi.